It's a feel thing. It's a Chevy versus Ford thing. That's all it is. Certain bats are end loaded versus balanced. Brady tends to like a more balanced bat. It's just a feel thing. So he's always liked a Louisville because they tend to be a little bit more on the balanced side. But when we've tried, like the big one's always DeMarini, and DeMarini is like the biggest one. But that DeMarinis are usually unloaded, and he just doesn't like the feel of them. So it's all feel. Yeah, yeah. Just it is. It's interesting to see that. And like I said, it's some people like Lee pants, some people like Dockers, flat front khaki. It's just a feel thing, that's all it is. And whatever feels comfortable in your hands when you're swinging. That's first and foremost, you got to be comfortable at the plate. So I don't know, but you see just as many kids hitting home runs with one bat versus another bat. So I don't think. There's guys that do all the science behind them. They weigh them to see how much percentage of an ounce they're off, or they do a barrel check, and they do all this stuff, and they'll tell you that there's like a slight advantage point of one versus the other. But end of the day, if you're going to hit a home run, you're going to hit a home run. That fraction of an inch of a bigger barrel is not going to be the difference between hitting a home run and hitting a double. So. Yeah. Oh, you'd be surprised. There's some of these guys on these groups that I'm on. I mean, they'll slice and dice any little thing about how it's going to make you a better player. And the nomenclature is that an $800 bat is not going to fix an $8 swing. That's essentially that's what you got to say. I mean, right? If you're going to work on the swing, you got to work on the swing, not get a new bat. You're not going to. There's no Lazarus bat out there that's just going to produce home runs, and all you got to do is put it out there. So that's. But that's a lot of people think the other way. They think that if they keep putting, $900 bats in their kids' hands, they're going to start raking in home runs. But they're sorely mistaken. Yeah. It's funny how that works. Yeah. 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 Which is nice because I think it allows you. I mean, the chapters in themselves are not very long, but and I think that kind of helps because you can diverge. I think a lot more into the topics versus here's what we read and here's what we kind of think. You really have the opportunity to really dive in deep and think deep thoughts with this. So I think it's a good thing. Mm-hmm. Sure. Leaders are the ones who run headfirst into the unknown. They rush toward the danger. They put their own interests aside to protect us or to pull us into the future. Leaders would sooner sacrifice what is theirs to save what is ours, and they would never sacrifice what is ours to save what is theirs. This is what it means to be a leader. It means they choose to go first into danger, head first toward the unknown. And when we feel sure they will keep us safe, we will march behind them and work tirelessly to see their visions come to life and proudly call ourselves their followers. So, nope, I was just going to do the same thing. The path that we choose. The boomers are all grown up. Is where we're navigating today. And I was mistaken. I thought that this chapter, and I don't think I read far enough into it, but I thought that this is where we start talking about the transition from boomers to millennials, and that's not the case. We actually have kind of a side shift after this into abstraction, but the millennials section is at the end of the book, and I forgot about that because he kind of wrote that millennials part towards the tail end of the book. So I apologize for anybody that was hoping to learn a thing or two about millennials. You're not going to get it this week. So yes. So this one, the big takeaway here, I think, is right here on the first slide. Implications of action. One act can drastically change the face of a company, a family, and a person for years and years to come. Now, whether we're talking about layoffs, furloughs, or changes to the structure of the company itself, we need to really understand how those changes are going to affect the people that they are affecting, essentially, before we do them. Don't make a knee-jerk reaction to balance the books by sacrificing a person. Don't create that knee-jerk reaction because somebody screwed up one time. We need to think a little bit before we act. The reaction is almost always, I'm going to fire that person, I'm going to reprimand that person. May not always be the best decision. I'm not saying you let everybody walk all over you. That's not the case here. But you need to understand the implications of your actions before you make them. And I think, where this chapter kind of navigates towards is kind of the desensitization, I think that's the word, of how we live our lives today. We're so much more prone to sending a text message versus calling, sending an email versus going to visit somebody. We live in a dehumanization world right now. And so oftentimes when we make those decisions, we think, well, I'll just write this email that absolutely scathes this person, and it's not going to matter because they're going to read it. And, I'm not going to have to be there to read their reactions or feel the feelings that they're feeling. I'm just going to write the damn email and get it off my chest. But then, the person on the other end gets the email, maybe they're having a bad day. Maybe their wife is, they're fighting with their family or whatever. You don't think about those things when you write those emails, and maybe you should sometimes think about those implications. Maybe that person is absolutely swamped. Maybe, for God's sake, maybe the person is dealing with some kind of health issue, cancer or something, and you just wrote an email scathing them about a little tiny issue that you had that they did. That's, it goes back to empathy. We've talked numerous times about empathy. Sometimes, writing those scathing emails is not the best choice because you're going to make that person feel 100 times worse. That person's going to probably want to quit. Or, if you're firing them, then they're going to roll into an even deeper depression than what they're in right now. So we need to think about those things before we act. Mm-hmm. That's well said. I think that's true. That's very true. It's just we have to stop that action, and I think as a whole, people are getting better and better with it, and as I see, but oftentimes we tend to think of that bottom line, that balance sheet, before we think about our people, and that's the wrong way of thinking about it. Your people are a hell of a lot more important than your balance sheet. And I'm not saying that you need to hire every Tom, Dick, and Harry on the street, just to make sure that everybody can have a job and feel good about themselves. That's not the case. I'm just saying that the people that you have, you need to protect them. And sometimes taking a cut on the balance sheet is not the way to solve the problem. It's not that's not, the right solution. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's a hard, it's a hard thing to do. I mean, especially now and this time and juncture in the world, where polarization and overreaction are probably two things that happen more common than not. Take for instance, we were talking about the election. You know, I the guy that I voted for didn't win. Is not. I mean, he hasn't conceded yet, but it appears that it's heading in the other direction. And does that mean that I want to go out and start yelling and hooting and hollering and throwing things at people and getting in people's faces? No, I don't. Because I think we'll move on as a country. It's the same thing when Trump was in office. We had all those people that were hooting and hollering and burning down buildings and stuff like that. That's uncalled for. I mean, you think about the effect that it had on the people that own those stores, those restaurants, those bars, those retail stores. Was that necessary? No. I mean, it's just acting selfishly. Different scenario. There's no bottom line attached to somebody that's throwing a Molotov cocktail into a clothing store, but there's no empathy there. There's no regard for the common man. And then that's a hell of a lot more important than the cause that you're trying to push on somebody else's agenda. So just a different example. Sorry to get political. So next slide there, essentially what happened when the boomers grew up, you had a period in time in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s when technology was running rampant. Good things were happening. Times were essentially, they were easy. Now they're not easy for everybody, but in general, things were very easy. Stuff happening. It was like you didn't even have to work at it and you could make something happen good. So you had a very good time. But what you also saw was that because of the nature of when the boomers were how they were raised, they were very, very close knit to their resources. So they basically held their cards tight to their chest. They didn't allow much to come away from them. So what happened was it created this dopamine type driven society where we keep putting the carrot out in front of the nose of the person, and they are never able to get it, but they just keep going for it and going for it and going for it. And what ended up happening is we created this entire culture of mistrust. We weakened our circle of safety because you had enough people in the industry that you could just throw people away and bring on new people. It didn't really matter because you had a plethora of people to choose from. So it really hurt. In the long run, it hurt because it really created this mindset that people don't matter, and what does matter is the bottom line. And that's what really causes a lot of frustration, when you enter in now the millennials who tend to think the exact opposite. They think that people are more important than the bottom line. And that's where you have a dramatic culture clash, if you will, between people that want to see that bottom line healthy and people that want to have other people healthy. So that was the big fundamental change as the boomers grew up. So, and it wasn't their fault, it was the way that they were raised. They were raised like that. You were raised to work hard. You were raised to hold your cards close to your chest. You were raised to leave no stone unturned. They rebelled a little bit from it, but in the end, your principles that you learn from your parents do carry true within your heart. Whether you like it or not, what you were taught as a kid is going to carry on for your lifetime. So, and that's how the boomers ran things. That's how the businesses were ran. When they were given the keys to the country, that's what happened. Not a bad thing. It's just part of society. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, right. And that's what you start to think about. Ultimately, anybody when they grow into parenthood, they tell themselves that, hey, I'm not going to make the same mistakes that my parents made. That's like a fundamental thing that the first time you have your first kid, like the first thing that comes in your mind is, I'm not going to make the same mistakes that my parents did. And that is how cultures are changed, is how they're formed. I mean, you look at the greatest generation that ever lived was very discipline heavy. They worked very hard, and they instilled that on their kids. And so their kids said, I'm not going to allow my kids to go through the same thing. I'm not going to make my kids have to work really hard and be very super disciplined. So they rebelled. And that's when you had like the 60s and free thought. I'm going to allow my kids to have free thought and free will. Okay, well, then they grew up, and to us, to the millennials, they had basically said, okay, I want my kids to have everything that they want. So you saw the fundamental shift between disciplining. It takes such a simple act like teaching in school. When the greatest generation was a part of us, and even the boomers, there was a lot of discipline in school. There was a lot of, okay, if you screwed up, you're going to own up for it. Now, in the millennial generation, the finger is pointed towards the teacher. The teacher did something wrong. It's not the student's fault. It's the teacher's fault. And all of that was just because of how the generations have changed. You can't discipline kids anymore in school like you could back in the 40s and the 50s. It's fundamentally, it can't happen. So that's just one example, but that's one of the biggest examples that you see in the changing in thought. And it's the same can be applied to business and how you run your businesses. The major thing that we need to get from these chapters is that we need to understand where all these generations are coming from, because we are at some point in time either going to work with, work for, or be associated with through business actions with somebody in a different culture and a different mindset. And you have to understand how they tick in order to be an effective business person. How your messages are conveyed, how you propose things, that all matters. You have to think about all those things before you just go out and act like you normally act. So that it's very important. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so and basically talk about the virtual world that we live in right now. It started back in I'd say in the advent of when the cell phones were really apparent. Late '90s, 2000s. The PC came about, internet came about. But even before that, we really lived in a world of great abundance. Like I said, you could almost have anything that you wanted, within reason. But you didn't struggle. You didn't have a hardship. Even in '08, things were not that bad. They weren't as bad as they were in the Great Depression in the 1920s. You didn't have to worry about food stamps and rationing. You didn't have to worry about things like that. So we've always lived, for the most part, in a world of great abundance. If you put the work in, you will probably be okay. But what happened was I think we lose a lot of that human element. And the one thing that I've been really pondering this past week is with the polarization that the country's in right now and COVID, are we going to be taking a step backwards, even further into dehumanization? We are so accustomed now to video calls and less accustomed to being in person and shaking hands and sitting across the table from somebody. Is COVID going to put us in a backward state because of that? Are we going to lose track of feelings and how people react and how we talk to people? Those are things that I think that we're going to have to really try to keep track of, because I think nowadays it's just 10 times easier to send a text message, 10 times easier to send an email. You don't have to worry about the reaction of the human. And that's a problem. That's a big problem. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 And there's a sentence in here that I really like. We will no longer see each other as people. We are now customers, shareholders, employees, avatars, online profiles, screen names, email addresses, and expenses. And that's how we define people. And that's what we kind of talk about abstraction now. That in the next few chapters we'll be talking about abstraction. That's what it's talking about is not we're not thinking about humans as humans. We're thinking about them as essentially line items. We're tagging them to emails. They're not people. It's not Nate I'm talking to. It's a coworker, and that's wrong. That's absolutely wrong. Whether it's your team or your customers or whatever they are, they're people too. Restriction kills. Yeah. And it'll start with the abstraction about like I said, how we are moving away from people being people and more into people are numbers. People they don't matter, and that's essentially what it is, and that's what it's a truth that we have to come to. It's a truth that we have to sit down and realize to ourselves, because I think I'll be the first to admit. I mean, there's certain times when you just lose track of that. You just lose track of the fact that humans are humans, and you just get so busy with things that you don't even think about it. You don't even think about sometimes some of the things that you send via text, via email. You just send them, because you're just, you're in the zone. And that's, it's a mistake. It's ultimately a mistake. It can make things worse. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yep. Sounds good. Thank you. We'll talk to you later.